Hi, this is Gail Sokol. On today's show, we're going to be talking about how to make a simple yeast bread. So on last week's show, we talked about fermentation and the process where yeast eat sugar and give off carbon dioxide, gas bubbles, and alcohol. And these carbon dioxide gas bubbles, as bakers of a yeasted bread, we want to capture them and we want them to get stuck. So how do they get stuck? They get stuck in this protein matrix, this gluten matrix. And that's made with wheat flour and water. And the two proteins in wheat flour are gliadin and glutenin when they mix with water. And that's in any wheat flour, all-purpose, whole wheat flour, bread flour, pastry flour, anything like that. They're going to form gluten. So this is almost like a spider web. It's very stretchy and it can hold these gases, this carbon dioxide gas. And it also holds air because air is always the invisible ingredient that we mix into a recipe. So in the oven, what's going to happen to this protein matrix? What's going to happen to the carbon dioxide? Well, we all know what happens to gases under pressure. Remember, it's stuck inside the dough. So these gases are going to want to escape, so they're going to push up on the dough above and below and next to it and on the side of it, and it's going to expand the dough. And then the structure, the protein is going to set, and it's going to create a nice structure to the bread. So that bread's going to rise, and it's going to set and get a beautiful, beautiful crumb and a texture of it inside and a whole structure. And that's what we love to make, and that's why we love to make yeasted breads. So I wanted to talk to you about the two types of breads that I want to bring up. There's many types of breads, but there's two basic types. One is a straight dough. So a straight dough is a dough that's made with yeast in which you combine all the ingredients, you let it rise, you do a few more things to it, and you bake it. And that is a straight dough. It's pretty straightforward, okay? Then there's another type of dough known as a pre-ferment. That means that the fermentation process has been started ahead of time. You don't make your true dough at first. You actually make a smaller dough. You take a little bit of flour, water, and a little bit of yeast, and you actually allow it to rise. And there are many types of pre-ferments. You're allowing it to ferment before you make your dough. So before, ferment. And sometimes you can allow this mixture to rise for 8 or 10 hours. Sometimes you can make an actual sourdough starter and you can use only a portion of it after it rises and keep the rest in the refrigerator for another use and keep it going. So there are many ways to make a pre-ferment. A pre-ferment, again, is when you pre-start your fermentation process. So you make a smaller dough with some yeast, flour, and water. And then after so many hours, it gets nice and bubbly, and the yeast starts, eating the sugars in there in that mixture, and actually start forming carbon dioxide and alcohol. It gets nice and bubbly. And before the yeast run out of gas, really, if you will, and run out of energy, you add it to other ingredients, more flour, more water, and you build a dough with it. What happens in this pre-ferment, this several hours of fermentation, very yummy organic compounds form. It's the best analogy I can make for you is if you drink a wine that's too young. That would be like a straight dough. It's not that young wines are bad, but they don't have the complexity of a more complex wine that's been aged longer, like a Cabernet Sauvignon or something that's a deeper red wine that's been aged for a couple of years. So the same thing with a yeasted bread. A pre-ferment puts some of these organic compounds to work and allows them to form over hours of time. And then when you start baking it and you start actually eating this, you realize, wow, this is like the Cabernet Sauvignon of breads. It actually has a more complex flavor because the flavorful compounds have had time to develop. So basically, we're going to make, in a little while, I'm going to show you how to make a straight dough, super easy straight dough. Remember, this is the easiest type where you just sort of blend all your ingredients together. And we're going to make what's known as a lean dough. A lean dough is a good dough to start baking yeast bread with, meaning if you've never made yeast bread, this is a great one to start with. It's simple, and it only uses 4 ingredients. A lean dough, just like the name lean, there's no fat in it. There's no sugar in it. It only has basically 4 ingredients: yeast, flour, salt, and water. That's it. Very, very simple, basic. And when you add all these ingredients, you can rehydrate your yeast and you create this beautiful dough, and the fermentation process begins. Once that yeast gets rehydrated, it has a source of food, it has some warmth and moisture, it will start producing carbon dioxide, gas bubbles, and alcohol. So let me give you a way to get the highest quality yeast breads. Okay, let's start by measuring ingredients properly. So once you measure your ingredients, you're going to mix and knead your dough. Your dough may be a little sticky, maybe not as firm and perfect as you might think a dough should be. But I always like a dough that's a little sticky. I don't like it that it's so dry and so full of flour. Sometimes I used to get drier breads when my doughs were not slightly sticky. I'm not saying it sticks to your fingers, but I'm saying you feel a little sticking to your fingers when you knead it. So the dough should feel slightly elastic and smooth. It shouldn't be lumpy or have bits of flour on the outside of it. Everything should be homogeneously blended of those 4 ingredients that I mentioned. After you create this dough, you're going to allow it to have what's known as a bulk fermentation. You're going to just put it in a bowl. Some people just leave it in the electric mixing bowl if that's where they make it. You can even make it by hand and just put it in a regular bowl and just leave it there for about an hour, hour and a half. Put it in a nice warm spot. Let your yeast get nice and happy, and you'll see it double in size, and it will be loaded with gas. It'll be loaded with carbon dioxide. Once this happens, I usually like to deflate the dough. So it's known as punching. If you ever look at a yeasted recipe for a yeasted dough, it'll say punch the dough. And some people literally stand over and punch down. And that was more or less the old-fashioned way to do it. You're really degassing it. You're taking out all the carbon dioxide and allowing the yeast to sort of refreshen itself and allow it to continue the fermentation process. So you deflate it by taking the outer edges of the dough and just bringing them into the center of the dough. Or you can just do a little punch if you want. I've done it both ways. And then once you do that, you want to shape it into whatever you're going to make it in. Today, we're just going to make a simple loaf. We're making it super simple for you beginner yeasted bread makers. And you're going to let that rise as well. So you're going to put it on a pan and you're going to let it rise. And this is known as proofing. And as we learned in the fermentation show, we are going to allow this dough to proof in the shape that it's going to go into the oven. So that's the last rising before you put it into the oven. And it may not double in size, but it should get a little bit bigger. It should get a little bit puffier. And at this point, you don't want to handle this dough because it's loaded with carbon dioxide. Remember, that's the only way our dough is going to rise. So if you push it out and you sort of push on it or punch it again, you're going to deflate it. So you don't want to do that. Let's get started. Let's actually create a simple yeast bread. All right. So the first thing you want to do, you want to blend your yeast, flour, and kosher salt together. And let me give you the proportions. 2 1/4 teaspoons or just 1 package of instant dry yeast. Remember, that's that Arnold Schwarzenegger yeast, where each yeast granule is very tiny, a lot tinier than active dry yeast. and it really packs a punch. It actually creates more carbon dioxide per yeast cell than active dry yeast. And it's so powerful, you don't even need as much as you might use on active dry yeast. But in this recipe, we're going to need the entire package of instant dry yeast or fast rising. It's the same thing. And we're going to mix it with 3 cups of bread flour. Bread flour is from the wheat plant. It is similar to all-purpose flour, but it has a slightly higher protein content. That's because we want to form a little more gluten. We want to get that stretchy protein matrix going so we get a nice puffy loaf of bread. And then we want to mix into that 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. And notice I said kosher salt. If you don't have kosher salt, don't worry, just use regular table salt. But kosher salt has a larger granule, and it actually just tastes better in breads. It actually gives a nice balance to the flavor. And you don't want to leave salt out of a bread recipe. It really makes a difference. It can actually help the dough become more elastic. It actually can control fermentation. So if it goes crazy and your yeast go nuts and start really replicating and forming too much gas, it'll actually control it. So salt is very important in bread baking. So in a large bowl, and it's going to be a large bowl, you're going to combine those first 3 ingredients, the yeast, the bread flour, and the salt. And you're going to blend them well. I usually do it with a whisk, but you can also do it with your hands. Next, you're going to add 1 cup plus 1 tablespoon of warm water. Now, you don't have to take the temperature of this water. Stick your finger in it. If you would take a bath in that water, it's perfect. Your yeast will love it too. You don't want it to be more than 110 degrees, so between 90 and 110 is perfect. So stick your finger in it. If it burns you, your yeast will die. If you put it in and it feels, yeah, I could see taking a bath in that, perfect. So you're going to pour the water in all at once, and you're going to mix it with a spoon. If the mixture seems a little dry, add a little more water and make sure that water is just as warm as the first cup and 1 tablespoon that you added. Next, you want to scrape your dough onto a lightly floured work surface. Don't make it too heavily floured, and you want to knead it until it forms a smooth bowl. By kneading it, Knead, that means you're going to be pushing the dough with your hand, the bottom of the palm of your hand, and then flipping it over, like sort of put it in half, almost like a clamshell, like the top over the bottom, and push again. And keep doing that, and you're going to see something amazing happen. Your dough is going to start looking less shaggy. Sometimes I think it looks like a shaggy dog. There'll be little bits of flour hanging off of it. You might see some, wet. One part may be extra wet. One part may be super dry. But once you start the kneading process, everything starts getting really happy together, and the dough becomes smooth and elastic. And that's exactly what you want. But again, slightly sticky. Slightly sticky is okay. Very sticky, where your hands are covered in the dough, that's too sticky, and you're going to have to add a little more flour. So next, you want to spray a medium bowl with nonstick cooking spray, or you can put a little drop of olive oil or just regular neutral canola oil into your bowl and move it around so it coats it, and then place your bowl of dough in it. Take your bowl of dough and flip it over so the grease side is up, and then cover it with plastic wrap. And this is where you're going to let it relax. So we've developed the gluten, and as you develop gluten, dough can become almost like a rubber band, very elastic. Remember I said it would be smooth and elastic, and that's good. But when you want to try to shape dough, it can become like a rubber band, and it can resist shaping, and it can be very frustrating. So you want to allow it to rise at this point, and you want it to double in size. Now, there are newer ovens now that actually can allow you to let your dough, your yeasted doughs, rise in the oven. They have an actual yeast rising or a dough rising temperature that you can actually set it at. It's very, very low. If you don't have that, you can actually take a tall kitchen garbage bag, put your bowl of dough covered, remember with plastic wrap, tightly covered, put it into this garbage bag that's got to be clean. And then you're going to just tie a knot in it so that it becomes almost like encased in a balloon, and let it set in a warm spot for about an hour and a half until it's doubled in size. When you open up that tall kitchen garbage bag, you may be surprised to find that your plastic wrap has ballooned out over the top of the dough, which means fermentation was wonderfully active. And you got a lot of carbon dioxide built up in your dough, which is exactly what you want. That means you're going to have a good loaf of bread. So once the dough has been allowed to rise and it's doubled in size, deflate it. So you can either give it a gentle punch, just remember a gentle punch, or you can deflate it by taking the outer edges and just pushing them into the center. And you'll actually hear the gas bubbles pop. You'll actually hear it deflate. That's why they call it degassing. So you will deflate that dough. It redistributes food for the yeast in the dough. It also will even out the temperature, because the warmest part of this dough is the center, because that's where fermentation is really going to be the most active, is going to be the center of this dough. So this is only going to prepare it for its second fermentation, which we call proofing, and that's where we let it rise in the shape that it's going to go into the oven. Again, fermentation never ends until that loaf of bread goes into the oven. So once you have, you're going to deflate the dough, and then you're going to shape it into a round loaf. Just shape it any way you want to a nice rounded loaf, and put it on either a sheet pan covered with nonstick cooking spray or just some aluminum foil or even parchment paper. And if you want to get fancy, you can sprinkle that with a little cornmeal on the bottom and just put your bread dough on top. So you have a little, like, that bakery tasting, bread that you might see in a bakery. It has a little cornmeal on the bottom. Sometimes it makes it taste a little crunchy on the bottom and gives you a nice crust just on the bottom, not on the top. And then you're going to allow this to rise. I cover it with a little parchment paper or even a clean kitchen towel, and just allow it to rise until it's doubled again. And in the meantime, you're going to preheat your oven as high as it'll go. 500, could be 525. Some ovens go higher than others, but 500 degrees is about good, about right. If you have a pizza stone or a baking stone, this is the time to preheat the oven with it on the bottom. So on the bottommost rack, remove the other racks, because remember, this dough is going to grow. You will put your pizza stone if you have one. If you don't, you'll just leave your dough right on the aluminum foil or the parchment paper. If you're going to be using a pizza stone, see if you can put parchment paper underneath your sheet pan. It'll make transferring it a little bit easier. Pizza stones are the way professional pizza makers will make a pizza. So these are like clay tiles or clay stones, and you can buy them in kitchen supply stores. A lot of people know how to make pizzas from home. It's like a really big thing now. You may not get your oven as hot as a real pizza oven in a professional pizza place, but you can get the crust quality that they get. And the pizza stone really helps. So the clay tiles must be heated. So you must really give them about an hour at 500 degrees. And you may smell the pizza tiles heating up or the pizza stone heating up. And once you really get it hot, you don't want to grease it. You don't want to touch it. You want to slide your dough into it at that high temperature. But before you do, I like to make a few decorative cuts on the top of my dough. So now I have this round loaf. All we made was one round loaf. And I'll take a razor blade. The French term for a bread baker that has a professional razor blade that they use just for bread baking is called a lame, L-A-M-E. Like, that's so lame, but it's not lame. It's sort of cool. It's like a razor on a handle. And you can make a few decorative cuts on the top of your loaf. And this helps with what's known as oven spring. Once you put your bread dough in the oven, you're going to see the fermentation process slow down because the yeast is going to slowly die. 140 degrees is the death point for yeast. And it's going to take time for this dough to get up to 500 degrees. So remember, it's going to take many, many minutes before. But before it does, there's going to be this wonderful last swan song of the yeast. It's going to allow those cuts, those decorative slits that you made with the razor, to open up and give one last rise before it dies for wonderful bread for you and your family. So this oven spring will cause those slits to open up and the dough to rise to its fullest height. Now, if you want to get some extra color on your dough and you want to sort of postpone this process of forming a crust too soon, because that'll happen. The dough is supposed to form a crust, and that's what we love about freshly baked bread, that yummy, yummy golden crust. You can spritz your dough with water. So you take a Spritz bottle and just fill it with water, just ordinary water, and just give it a few spritzes. You don't want it to be sopping wet. You just want to give a few spritzes, and then you put it into the oven, either on your sheet pan or you can put it on your baking stone. And the way I get it on my baking stone is I use a peel. And a peel is wooden or stainless steel piece of metal or wood with a handle on it. And it allows you to sort of shush your bread into the oven on top of your pizza stone. If you don't have one, you can just slide the rack out and put your parchment paper that you have your bread rising on and put the parchment paper right in the oven with the bread on it. You can even do that with the aluminum foil as well. But if you don't have a pizza stone, don't worry. Just put it on the bottom, the lowest rack that you can. And that's all I would do. Sometimes in the first 5 minutes of baking, I will open the oven door and spritz it once every minute and a half or so. Just once every minute and a half within the first 5 minutes. This allows the crust to basically be postponed from firming up too much and allows that oven spring to happen even more. And then once the proteins in that wheat flour coagulate, they set up and they get firm, just like an egg, just like we talked about in previous programs when we talked about eggs. Eggs firm up when they're heated. Well, there's proteins in the wheat flour and in our bread, and they're going to firm up. There's even starches in flour, and they're going to gelatinize. They're going to absorb all the water that was in our ingredients, and they're going to firm up as well. So all these things give structure to our bread. And then that beautiful crust is going to form. And once we see a nice color, this should take 15 minutes or so. You're going to look in your oven. If you think your dough or your bread now it's a bread, everything has set, it's golden brown, you can take it out. Some people have a very hot oven. It depends on what it looks like. If you thump it with your fingers, sort of like the doctor thunks your chest or the back of your back, just to make sure your lungs are working well and everything sounds good. If it sounds hollow, it's done. If not, some people actually pierce it with a thermometer. I don't like to do that because I don't like to deface my bread and put a thermometer in it. So I usually go by color and by thunking. And if the color's golden brown, take it out. If it's not, you can rotate it, just sort of move your parchment around. Or if you have a peel, just shush it around so it's 180 degrees turn and just leave it in for another 5 or 10 minutes. Take it out, and you don't want to eat hot bread. It can be very gummy. So you want to let it get to warm room temperature, and then by all means, cut into it because it's going to be delicious. I have a few tips for you about storing bread. So if you're going to eat this bread for one meal, make sandwiches, whatever you want to do with this bread, do it within 8 hours. You don't have to wrap it. You don't have to do anything. You let it hang out for up to 8 hours. Perfect at room temperature. What you don't want to do is you never want to refrigerate bread. The refrigerator can be very drying, and it can also help that bread stale faster. So the best thing to do is freeze it if you're not going to eat it within 8 hours. Even if you just want to freeze a portion of it, you only ate half the loaf and you want to freeze it. So you want to let it get to room temperature, really cool it down completely. You want to wrap it in plastic wrap and then aluminum foil. And then sometimes I do a third layer by putting it into a third protective layer by putting it into a plastic bag and just getting all the air out and twist tying it, dating, labeling it, and putting it in the freezer. It'll stay in the freezer 3 or 4 months. And you can thaw it, and you can even put it back into the oven to refresh it. Put it back either on your pizza stone or on a sheet pan at about 450 degrees Fahrenheit for just maybe 10 minutes. And you'll get that crust right back. It's absolutely delicious to do that. So we made a simple yeast bread today. If you have any questions about bread baking or fermentation, head on over to bakingradio.com. Leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air. Next week, we're going to be discussing quick breads.